In December 2020, while the world was still trying to make sense of a pandemic, Wall Street quietly opened the door to something that had never been done before. Water, that substance covering 70% of the planet, that the human body cannot survive 3 days without, that entire civilizations were built around, was listed as a tradable financial asset on the American Stock Exchange, alongside oil, alongside gold, alongside grains and rare metals. It was not an accident. It was not an experiment. It was a declaration. The Nasdaq Veles California Water Index formalized what corporations and investment funds had been quietly building for decades. A global market where the right to access drinking water can be bought, sold, and speculated on like any other asset. The index tracks the price of water use rights in California, a state that, on its own, is the fifth largest economy in the world, and where the competition for water access among farmers, cities, and industries was already fierce long before Wall Street entered the game. And the most disturbing part is not that this happened, it's that almost no one noticed. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single episode. Tell me in the comments, did you know water became a commodity on Wall Street? And what city in the world are you watching from right now? The history of water privatization does not begin in 2020. It begins much earlier. In every moment, a government signed a contract believing it was solving a problem, and in reality was creating a new master for its people. To understand what is happening today, you need to understand the path that led here. How a resource that humanity always treated as a common good, regulated, shared, protected by ancient laws across cultures on every continent, became the largest untapped market of the 21st century. The answer does not lie in scarcity, even though scarcity is real. It lies in decisions made by corporations and governments that chose, deliberately, to turn survival into a product. And there is one name that captures the brutality of this process better than any other. Bun, a name that, when spoken publicly in 2005, sparked protests around the world. Peter Brabeck-Letmathe, then chief executive of Nestlé, the largest food company on the planet, gave an interview for the Swiss documentary We Feed the World that became a historical document. In it, he classified as an extreme view the idea that water should be considered a human right. His argument was straightforward. Water has market value and should be priced accordingly. In his view, assigning a cost to water is the only way to protect it, because what has no price is not valued. The logic sounds cold, and it is. But it is not naive. It is the philosophical foundation of a business model that Nestlé applied in practice across dozens of countries around the world. The most emblematic case took place in San Bernardino, California. During years of historic drought, some of the worst droughts recorded in the state in a century, Nestlé, through its water division later sold and rebranded as Blue Triton brands, continued extracting millions of liters of water from the region. The legal basis was an extraction permit dating back to 1865. 155 years. A post-Civil War document that a multinational corporation used to justify removing water from a region in the midst of a water crisis, while farmers were losing crops and cities were implementing severe consumption restrictions. The extraction fees paid to the California State Agency were negligible, amounts that, compared to the retail price of bottled water on the consumer market, represented an extraordinary financial return. The California State Water Resources Control Board, in a 2021 report, concluded that Nestlé had extracted water beyond what its historical rights authorized. That is the model: minimal state costs, maximum sales margins, and a resource being pulled from a commons, a shared good, to become private property inside a branded bottle. Brabeck later walked back his most controversial statements, claiming he had been misunderstood. But the company's actions in the regions where it operated told a different story than the public relations language. What happened in Cochabamba, Bolivia, in 1999, told that story without any ambiguity. Cochabamba is Bolivia's third-largest city. In 1999, under pressure from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the Bolivian government privatized the city's public water supply system. The contract was awarded to the consortium Aguas del Tunari, led by the American corporation Bechtel. The rationale presented was the same as always. Private management would be more efficient, attract investment, and modernize aging infrastructure. What happened in the weeks that followed was immediate and brutal. Water rates rose by an average of 35%, in some cases more. This in a region where a significant portion of the population lived on less than $100 a month. For many families, the water bill came to represent a quarter or more of their monthly income. A choice between drinking water and eating. But there was something even more disturbing. Law 2029, passed by the Bolivian government as part of the privatization process, went beyond managing public water networks. It effectively granted the consortium control over alternative water sources, including private wells that communities had built with their own hands over decades. And in its most extreme interpretation, the law allowed the company to charge for water collected from rain in private cisterns. Water from the sky, made the property of an international consortium. The people of Cochabamba responded. Protests began in January 2000 and escalated in intensity and brutality over the following months. Police were mobilized. There were confrontations. A 17-year-old named Victor Hugo Daza was shot and killed during the demonstrations. The government declared a state of siege. But the people did not back down. In April 2000, the Bolivian government terminated its contract with the Aguas del Tunari consortium. The company left. Bechtel, unsatisfied, sued the Bolivian government for $50 million before an international arbitration tribunal, invoking a bilateral investment treaty between Bolivia and the Netherlands to claim future profits from a contract that had been canceled due to a popular uprising. International pressure and a global solidarity campaign eventually led Bechtel to drop the lawsuit in January 2006. The Guerra del Agua, as it became known, entered history as one of the first major conflicts of the 21st century over control of water. But it would not be the last. In the card above, you'll find our episode on how Monsanto patented life and sued 140 farmers for planting their own seeds. The same model of corporate control over essential resources that we are documenting here. While Cochabamba was becoming a symbol of resistance on the other side of the world, corporations of a far larger scale were quietly building an empire over urban water management. Veolia and Suez are French companies, but the national label is almost irrelevant when talking about corporations of this scale. Together, they manage water supply for hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries. Cities in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe have entrusted, or been persuaded to entrust, their drinking water management to these two companies. The model is called a public-private partnership, PPP. The terminology is elegant and technical enough to sound responsible. The government retains formal ownership of the infrastructure, but delegates operation, maintenance, and sometimes investment to a private company that charges for the service and seeks profit. In theory, it is a way of bringing private sector efficiency to public services without giving up state control. In practice, the results have been consistently more complicated than the contracts promised. The case of Flint, Michigan, is an example that deserves close attention. Not because Veolia directly caused the crisis, but because the company's role in that disaster reveals the structural contradictions of the private consulting and management model for water infrastructure. In 2014 and 2015, the city of Flint switched its water source to cut costs, drawing from the Flint River instead of the Detroit system. The change, made without proper corrosion treatment, resulted in lead contamination across a significant portion of the distribution network. Veolia was hired as a consultant to assess water quality. Its initial reports did not flag the lead problem as urgent. The crisis continued. Children were exposed to dangerous levels of lead, an irreversible neurological harm to child development. Subsequent investigations raised serious questions about the diligence of the consulting services provided. Veolia disputed the allegations. Legal proceedings dragged on. But the Flint episode made visible something the PPP model prefers to keep out of public scrutiny. When a private company has financial incentives to downplay problems, because identifying failures means additional remediation costs, corporate interest and public interest can diverge dangerously. The more recent merger between Veolia and Suez, completed in 2022 after an intense corporate battle that included a hostile takeover bid and months of legal disputes in France, created an even larger colossus. The concentration of power over water management in fewer private hands is not a secondary trend. It is the central movement of the global water market in the coming decades. The question that none of the executives at these companies answers directly is simple. When the pursuit of profit conflicts with maintaining infrastructure in a poor city, which one wins? The historical data suggests a consistent answer. But water privatization is not only a corporate phenomenon. It is also, increasingly, a weapon of the state. The Tigris River and the Euphrates River originate in Turkey. They flow through Syrian and Iraqi territory. They fed the first civilizations in human history: Mesopotamia, the cradle of writing, of structured agriculture, of the first cities. These rivers are not merely natural resources. They are the historical foundation of human existence in the Middle East. Turkey, over recent decades, has built 22 dams on these rivers as part of the so-called GEP project, Güneydoğu Anadolu Projesi, or the Southeastern Anatolia Project. The stated objective is regional development, irrigation, hydroelectric power, modernization of the country's southeast. None of these objectives is false, but the geopolitical consequences are unambiguous. When Turkey decides to hold water behind its dams, the flow reaching Iraq and Syria diminishes. During periods of drought, which climate change is making more frequent and severe, that reduction can be devastating. Iraq, which depends on the Euphrates for irrigation of much of its agriculture, has experienced growing water crises directly linked to the operation of Turkish dams upstream. Studies by the Iraqi Ministry of Water Resources have documented reductions in the flow of the Euphrates of more than 40% compared to historical averages, an impact that combines the operation of Turkish and Syrian dams with the effects of global warming. Water has become, without any formal treaty declaring it, a lever of diplomatic power. Turkey does not need to threaten Iraq militarily to exert pressure on it. It simply controls when and how much water flows down the river. And while this unfolds in the Middle East, a tension of even greater scale is developing in northeastern Africa. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, is the largest hydroelectric facility on the African continent. Ethiopia built it on the Blue Nile, one of the Nile's main tributaries. The project is legitimate in the context of Ethiopian development. Ethiopia is a country of more than 120 million people, with a serious energy deficit. The dam could transform its electricity capacity and potentially export power to neighboring countries. Egypt, however, depends on the Nile for 95% of its freshwater supply. The Nile is not just a river for Egypt. It is the precondition for its existence as an agricultural and urban nation. When Ethiopia began filling the dam's reservoir, starting the process in July 2020, Egypt responded with increasingly bellicose language. Egyptian officials spoke openly of all options to protect the country's water interests. Sudan, geographically situated between the two countries and equally dependent on the Nile, oscillated diplomatically between the two positions according to its own water and energy interests. And behind this geopolitical tension, almost invisible but present in every construction contract, are the corporations. Large-scale engineering and construction companies, often financed by the World Bank and regional development banks, collected billions from building the dams in Turkey and the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. The geopolitical conflict is not an obstacle to these contracts. In many cases, it is the context that makes them necessary. The pattern repeats with disturbing precision. A government decides to build monumental water infrastructure. Private construction and consulting corporations win the contracts. The World Bank or similar institutions finance the project. The government is left with the debt. The corporation keeps the profit. And the neighboring countries are left with the geopolitical bill that no one calculated in the original budget. But the story does not end there, because in some parts of the world, cities and citizens began to understand what was happening, and they decided to reverse course. Paris partially privatized its water system in the 1980s and 1990s, handing management over to Veolia and Suez. In 2010, after studies conducted by the city government itself identified estimated annual overcharges of 35 million euros, lack of transparency in contracts, and insufficient investment in maintenance, the city of Paris decided to take back public control of its water. In 2011, Eau de Paris, a municipal public company, took full control of the city's water supply. Documented results included rate reductions and reinvestment of surpluses into infrastructure and social programs for vulnerable populations to access water. Berlin followed a similar path. After partially privatizing its water system in the 1990s, the city faced rate increases and conflicts with private partners, including a dispute that reached the German Federal Court of Audit, which identified contractual clauses guaranteeing minimum returns to the companies regardless of management efficiency. In 2013, Berlin completed the buyback of the private company's shares and restored public control. The process was costly, more than 1 billion euros to recover what had been sold. But the political decision was clear. Water is a public service, not a market. This global remunicipalisation movement, the public reclaiming of services that had been privatized, documented more than 300 cases across more than 60 countries over the past 2 decades, according to research by organizations such as the Transnational Institute. It is not a marginal trend. It is a systematic response to documented failures of the privatization model. And in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution formally recognizing access to drinking water and sanitation as a fundamental human right. The resolution was approved with 122 votes in favor, 0 against, and 41 abstentions. Among those abstaining were the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. The UN document was a direct response to the expansion of the privatization model. Its message was unambiguous. Water is not a commodity, it is a right. And rights are not bought and sold on stock exchanges. But UN resolutions do not cancel concession contracts. They do not revoke 1865 extraction licenses. They do not undo billion-dollar corporate mergers. The gap between what international law declares and what global markets practice is precisely the space where control over water continues to be contested, purchased, and consolidated. The question that remains, and that no hedge fund executive, no PPP contract, and no consulting report answers directly, is this. When the last water source in a region falls under private control, WHO decides who drinks and who doesn't. When an investment fund determines that profit margins require a rate hike in a city where most of the population is already spending beyond what it can afford, what is the mechanism of restraint? In Cochabamba, the mechanism of restraint was the human body in the streets. It was Victor Hugo Daza at 17 years old. It was the state of siege that could not contain the determination of a people who understood viscerally that water is not negotiable. The remunicipalization of Paris and Berlin showed that returning to public control is possible, but expensive, slow, and politically costly. Cities that sign 30 or 40-year contracts with private operators often discover, midway through the term, that early exit involves penalties and international arbitration proceedings that make the return prohibitive for smaller, poorer governments. The design of these contracts is not naive. It is precise. And while the wealthiest cities in the world debate remunicipalisation, the water futures market on Wall Street grows. Sovereign funds, pension funds, and hedge funds study water assets, aquifer use rights, irrigation quotas, supply concessions, as the next great asset class of the 21st century. The cycle closes where it began. A resource that humanity had never fully priced is being integrated, piece by piece, contract by contract, merger by merger, into the global financial system. The Nasdaq Veles California Water Index of 2020 was not the beginning of this story. It was simply the moment when it became too visible to ignore. The question is not whether water will run out. Hydrologists debate scarcity with data and projections that vary widely. The issue is structural and political. Who will hold the key to turn on the tap? Who decides in a world of growing scarcity and growing demand which city drinks, which farmland gets irrigated, which industry operates, and at what price? If that key is in the hands of democratic governments, subject to elections and public pressure, the correction mechanism exists. Imperfect, slow, but it exists. If it is in the hands of corporations whose only formal mandate is return to shareholders, the correction mechanism is the market. And markets have no conscience. They have no memory of Victor Hugo Daza. They have not read the 2010 UN resolution. Every generation faces its version of this conflict. The names of the companies change. The continents vary. But the underlying structure, private power exercised over a public resource, with costs socialized and profits privatized, repeats with a consistency that cannot be attributed to chance. If you want to keep following how this mechanism works, behind the scenes of markets, in the contracts, governments sign away from the spotlight, in the corporate decisions that shape who has access to what is essential, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Every episode is a different piece of the same pattern. Hit like if this investigation surprised you, and tell me in the comments, do you believe water should be managed exclusively by the state, or is there a public-private partnership model that actually works? I want to read your analysis.